Leonardo's Mona Lisa, which fortunately is still #1 in terms of iconic representations of emotion. And that enigmatic smile of Mona Lisa, about which many people in my business have made their careers, right? Trying to figure out exactly what is represented by this particular expression. And so various theories about the Mona Lisa. Is she pregnant? Is this a self-portrait of Leonardo in drag, and so this sort of grin that she has on her face? Interestingly, Giorgio Vasari, the 16th century artist and chronicler, said that when Leonardo painted his portraits, he would have musicians and jesters in the room entertaining his subjects, because it kind of warded off the melancholy. These are the words of Vasari. That painting kind of automatically imbued in the subject matter. In other words, when you paint something, you kind of freeze it in time. And so the idea of making his subjects smile, which again is not a very common thing to see in Renaissance art. This is a discussion that I have very often with my students. And why do we not see people smiling? And more importantly, why do you not see teeth very often in Renaissance art? And the answer is a hygienic one. You really don't want to see their teeth in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. And so the idea of kind of honing down these emotions. Now, if we were to back all the way up to classical art, to ancient Greek and Roman art, and these classical examples of sculpture, what you see is that classical statuary usually does not express emotion. We see these idealized figures, like here the Apollo Belvedere, who I jokingly refer to as the 2% body fat, Evian water drinking people. Right? There are these perfect physical specimens inside of which we have perfect spiritual specimens as well. And so the idea that because a majority of classical statuary was divine in subject matter, the idea is that they don't suffer the same kind of human condition, the highs and the lows that we do, at least in this classical period. The classical would then give way to Hellenistic style sculpture, where the pathos would replace the ethos. And remember, this notion of pathos, which from the Greek literally means suffering, so that when something is pathetic, for us it has a negative connotation, but what they really mean is that it is something that evokes emotion. And perhaps the most celebrated of these Hellenistic sculptures is, of course, the Laocoon that you see here up on the screen, which shows this moment technically of assassination. That gentleman in the center was the high priest of ancient Troy, who was responsible for coining one of the most cliche expressions in history, and that is, beware of Greeks when bearing gifts. Right? He was the high priest of Troy, warning his co-citizens not to accept the wooden horse, but before he could, he was assassinated through the intervention of Athena and Poseidon. So now we went from essentially still emotionless classical statuary to almost an excess of emotion in pieces like this. But with the fall of the ancient world, at the end of the 5th century AD, emotion and expression disappeared almost entirely from art, particularly when we enter into the Byzantine period. And so now we shift to the Italian city of Ravenna. And if you want to see great Byzantine art, you don't go to a city that we call Istanbul today. We used to call Constantinople. You instead go to Ravenna, Italy, which is the sort of para-Constantinople. And here in the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, which was constructed and reconstructed in the 6th century after Christ, in the upper register of what we call the clear story level, is the earliest known cyclical representation of the life of Jesus Christ. And I show you one example of this sort of expressionless style of art. Here we have the Marys at the tomb. So this is the moment on Easter morning where the Marys have gone to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus Christ, only to find the tomb empty. And we have an angel who looks like he has had a frontal lobotomy. Right? We have Marys who they look like silent movie actors, where essentially they kind of exaggerate that gesture. Where is he? Sort of thing. You can almost see the caption appearing at the bottom of the scene. Because in the Byzantine world, the emphasis was on the divine again. The notion essentially that things were abstracted, and that human condition, the highs and the lows, were essentially abstracted out of the art that they created. The first time that it appears again in Western art, not surprisingly, is in a place called the Scrovegni Chapel in an Italian city called Padova, painted by, in my opinion, one of the greatest painters of all time, Giotto, or as we mutilate that name in English, Giotto. Okay, but after an evening with me, you'll pronounce it Giotto, okay? And you'll also do the dramatic hand gesture when you pronounce, okay? Giotto, technically speaking. Painting in the early 14th century. You see, we're in about 1303. And perhaps, Bonnie, next time I come, if there is a next time, perhaps there'll be a pineapple next year that I can talk about, we will talk about the storytelling inside of the Scrovegni Chapel. I like to refer to it technically as the first ever movie in history, because Giotto really does include all those same elements that you see here. And what I would like to do is essentially to break down our kind of survey of the expressions of art in medieval, or expressions of emotion in medieval and Renaissance art, not by a simple chronological telling of the story, but instead by breaking it up into categories of emotion. And so the first is despair. Right? And we start off inside of the Scrovegni Chapel, because this is how the story of the Scrovegni Chapel actually begins. It is essentially the life of the Virgin Mary. And if you're not familiar with this story, it is because it is not biblical. The story of the Virgin Mary is apocryphal. It is told in a 13th century text called the Golden Legend. But the essence of Mary's story is one that will be familiar to many of you, because technically Mary's parents, whose names were Joachim and Anne, were very old, but were without child, which in Judeo culture was seen as a kind of punishment by God, right, to withhold technically a child from them. And so the story of the life of the Virgin Mary in the Scrovegni Chapel begins with the expulsion of Joachim. Week after week, Joachim, eventual father of the Virgin Mary, has frequented temple, has offered sacrifice to God. But obviously, God was not heeding those sacrifices because he remained without child. So finally, the high priest of the temple said, "Basta, enough." Obviously, it's not working, and so Joachim is in fact expelled. He is kicked out of temple. And that lamb that he was hoping to sacrifice now becomes his kind of safety blanket, his teddy bear there in his arms. Of course, the genius Giotto, showing us the advanced age of Joachim by this white hair that you see, which again is perhaps the most obvious thing to do. You want to make a man look old, and so therefore you make his hair white. But artists at the beginning of the 14th century weren't doing it. Giotto was. And to really make the message of this particular episode hit home, look at the juxtaposition of what's happening outside the temple to what's happening inside. There is a younger man, and we know he's younger because he has a full head of brown hair, who is receiving a blessing from one of the priests, probably just informing him that his wife was expecting. So while we have fortune inside of the temple, we have disfortune outside of the temple instead. And so Giotto then moves us into the next scene. Right? So if this were the beginning of a movie, the soundtrack behind would be that kind of dramatic cello music, that sort of sad, melancholic sound that you see. Because in the next scene, we have Joachim going out into the wilderness. Okay, so I'm showing you the exact sequence. Would anyone like to describe to me the emotional state of this man? Depressed, sad. I like down in the dumps. And I imagine if there were empty aluminum cans here on the ground, that Joachim would be kicking those cans as he walked along. But it's not enough to tell me that he is sad or depressed or down in the dumps. What you need to tell me now is how we know that, and how Giotto was a mastery of emotional expression. We know it because his head is bowed. And so when you're sad, technically you have a tendency to bow your head. We know it because, look at Fido here. yelping away, so happy to see his owner. Right? But Joachim is oblivious. His stare goes beyond the dog. He doesn't really acknowledge, technically, the celebration of it. The gesture of Joachim hugging his midsection. Again, it's the most primal of gestures. Because Homo erectus stood up, we expose all of our vital organs. This is our most vulnerable part. So when we are under distress or duress, our instinct is to immediately cover up like this. These simple gestures immediately communicate what Joachim's emotional state was at the time. And how do we know that Joachim is not always like this? How do we know he's not manic depressive or something? Anyone? Look at these two. Look at that expression there. That shooting a glance over to the other guy, and you can hear their thoughts. We don't have dialogue, we don't have audio in this particular medium, but we don't need it because that glance is essentially saying, what's up with him? Obviously, there's something wrong. Folks, for the early 14th century, this is beyond the comprehension. This is beyond the reach of anyone. There are artists who in the 20th century could not achieve the same level of emotional expression. It's mind-boggling what Giotto was able to do, and more importantly, when he was able to do it. All right, now we're going to jump out of narrative sequence to another of the scenes in the Scrovegni Chapel expressing despair. And some would say that this is the most celebrated of all the scenes in the Scrovegni. I disagree. I will show you what I think is the most powerful of the scenes from the Scrovegni at the very end of this lecture. But the lamentation that you see here is powerful nonetheless. We have the body of Christ in the arms of his mother. And by framing the two with these figures here with their backs to us, it kind of transforms the lamentation into a pietà. Right, kind of cutting it off technically here. Mary Magdalene by the feet of Christ, the landscape leading your eye down to this incredibly emotional interaction between mother and dead son. But my favorite part of both this scene and others that Giotto painted is the inclusion here of these angels. The angels serving the same purpose that a Greek chorus does in theater. They're there showing us that heaven is mourning the death of Jesus Christ. And look at these individual gestures of just despair. The arms that are thrown out, hands that are folded. The figure here grabbing its cheeks as well. It's the most simple thing, but of course the expression is the great ones always make it look simple. And no one does it better than Giotto. Although Giotto did have an air as regards emotional expression. About a century later, another Florentine artist came along whose name was Masaccio. Now, Masaccio does not get anywhere near as much credit as he should. And the reason is because his life was cut short at the ripe old age of 27. His painting career lasted only about 4 years or so, from about 1423 to about 1428. And this is the Brancacci Chapel in the city of Florence, which along with the Scrovegni Chapel at one end and the Sistine Chapel at the other, for me, represent the three kind of milestone decorative complexes of the Renaissance. And on the interior wall up here on the left-hand side, you will see one of Masaccio's most famous paintings and one of the greatest and effective representations of emotions in history. And that is his expulsion from Eden. Very simple scene, but an incredibly effective one, where Masaccio in fresco paints Adam and Eve, who have been expelled from Eden, evicted, technically speaking. Here's the gate going in. There is the voice of God. There's the angel put there to protect them and to prevent them from going back in. And notice how Masaccio has changed the story. He has taken artistic license, because Adam's hands should be covering his genitalia. Instead, he has brought those hands up to his face because he's so stricken with grief that he forgets to cover his own indecency. And behind those hands, the cringing of the eyes, the pulling back of the mouth that you see. Of course, this is the physiognomy that accompanies both grief and laughter, ironically enough, because our facial expressions are the same for both. And then we look at Eve, who is in this classical Venus pudica, or modest Venus pose, that very naturalistic body type for the early 15th century. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the entire painting is her face, where naturalism has been overridden by emotion. And I remember seeing this painting for the first time back in 1993 as an undergraduate student, right after the completion of the restoration of the chapel, and immediately thinking of another much more famous late 19th century painting called the Scream, where technically now we're getting almost into expressionism, so that he's distorted reality to communicate this notion of grief. This is mind-boggling stuff for the beginning of the 15th century. And Giotto and Masaccio are the anchors, technically, to these later expressions of emotion. One in particular. And again, this is another piece I think that needs no introduction. Michelangelo's Pietà, which he carved at the whopping age of 23, by the way. My favorite sculpture by Michelangelo. And the reason is because one of the things that I often suggest to my students is that in an attempt to capture the essence of a work of visual art, to try to equate that work of art with a piece of music. And it doesn't have to be classical. Of course, we presume there would have to be lofty and academic sort of thing, and it really doesn't. So that, for instance, when I think of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, what I hear is a full symphony orchestra. There are a lot of different musical pieces involved in that ceiling. It's so complex. When I think of Michelangelo's David, and I'll show you the David in just a minute, I hear the whistling in the old spaghetti westerns, you know, that sort of shootout kind of thing that goes on. When I look at the Pietà, what I hear is a solitary violin or a solitary clarinet. Right? Quiet, it is silent. And this is something that's very out of character for Michelangelo, whose works are usually overwhelmingly dramatic. And that's what I think, he's kind of sublimated. It's too powerful an emotion here for a mother to lose her son. So he doesn't try with the exaggerated gesture. He doesn't try with the exaggerated facial expressions. What he shows you is this whimper on the part of the Virgin Mary, and he expresses it in an incredibly beautiful way, and that is that left hand of Mary that's sort of thrown out in surrender, thrown out in inevitability. She knew from the very beginning how this story was going to end. And so this incredibly still scene where essentially the emotion becomes almost too powerful to be expressed. And that obviously is an extraordinary thing. Now, other artists who have also successfully, and I think rather dramatically, expressed despair. One of my absolute favorites, who is Caravaggio, his deposition here from the Vatican museums. And of course, Caravaggio painting at the beginning of the 17th century, who kind of shocked the world at the time, because he was the first painter to really paint directly from live models. So every time you see a Caravaggio painting, you have to imagine figures posing for him, and Caravaggio painting directly from them. Now, the market at the beginning of the 17th century was still demanding mainly religious subject matter in the art. And the problem is that most of the models that Caravaggio was using for his paintings were people from his kind of stomping ground that consisted mainly of brothels and taverns. And we'll get into a bit more of this in just a sec. So this figure of Jesus, this is a very stark and realistic image of a recently deceased man. Look at the rigor mortis there, with that finger that's sort of stuck to the side of the stone. That right hand of the male figure here about to slip into the side, kind of a foreshadowing of doubting Thomas. The silent agony of this man. And again, if you've ever had to deal, as many of us have, with someone passing, you go through, you get through it somehow. And that's what's happening here. He's carrying him into the tomb, but you can see that almost indifferent look on his face because he's holding back the emotion. The Virgin Mary, you know, after seeing that virgin who looks actually younger than her son, Caravaggio instead, following through the sort of naturalistic tradition of showing figures at their appropriate age. And so this older figure of Mary, here we have Veronica with her veil, and the ever dramatic Mary Magdalene. With her arms thrown out in the back as well. And it feels like something real. And this is something I think many of us can look at these paintings and kind of almost remind us of our own personal experiences. And this is really what hits home with a figure like Caravaggio. It's earthy. Some would even say seedy in its representation. And one of his most famous representations of despair is, of course, his Death of the Virgin Mary in the Louvre in Paris. And again, you see these incredibly realistic depictions of grief. You know, this is a pose that I've seen so many times at funerals, that head just kind of resting there, helpless on the chin, the man crying over the dead body of the Virgin, the apostles gathered beyond, Mary Magdalene down below, mourning as well. And curiously, Caravaggio's earliest biographer actually claimed that the model that he used for the deceased Mary was actually a prostitute that they had recently dredged out of the Tiber River. They found her floating face down, and then, of course, as we always like to do, the tabloids picked up and said perhaps she was expecting and that the child was actually Caravaggio's. And so that is his sort of tribute to her as well. And so this sort of mix, if you will, of tragic subject matter with real characters now who have been inserted into the scene. But let us leave this negative emotion for a positive one, joy. And surprisingly, this actually was the category that was most difficult for me to find examples of. Well, I was kind of curious. In fact, not surprisingly, we go back to Giotto. Right? So that story that we began earlier of Joachim being kicked out, of Joachim going out into the wilderness. Now, I don't have the time or the luxury to go through the entire sequence with you. So here are the cliff notes. What happens is Joachim went out into the wilderness and decided to offer his own sacrifice. If the temple wouldn't accept it, then he would do it himself. And while he was doing this, his wife, Anne, received a message from an angel saying that she was expectant with child. And so this is every screenwriter's dream, every movie director's dream when you're reading the story and how you're going to visualize it, because Joachim was out in the wilderness, Anne was in the city. They don't have cell phones, so they can't text each other. You know, honey, come home, I just found out I'm pregnant. And so it's that cliche Hollywood movie scene where Joachim's running in. Of course, we're going to show it in slow motion, his hair blowing in the wind. Anne is running out, and they actually meet each other at the Golden Gate. So this is a famous meeting at the Golden Gate. Now, what would be the normal action for a married couple which has been waiting its entire collective life for a child to perform when they finally see each other? To hug and to kiss. And that's exactly what Giotto does. What you're looking at here, everyone, is the seminal, iconic kiss in the history of visual art, all the way up to what you see in the movie screen today, whether it's Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, whether it's Gustav Klimt. It all goes back to that first scene. And so this very joyous notion of the two of them just losing themselves, perhaps even breaking with proper decorum and kissing in the street. But look how Giotto pushes it one step forward, where it's not just this kiss and this hug, it's two becoming one. His body, her body, his right eye, her left eye, his nose, their mouth, her left arm, his right arm. And what is the meaning of procreation if not the fact that two figures have become one? Pushing it into a deeper level. And look at his Greek chorus back here. These women who are just watching the scene, and they are just bubbling with happiness, these grins on their faces. You can almost imagine them bouncing up and down. And the analogy I always use with my students, it's like when you're back in high school and your best friend's talking to the quarterback of the football team for the first time, and you're hiding behind and you're just beside yourself with emotion. And that's exactly what you see with the figures that you see there. It's an incredibly successful representation of happiness. There is joy in Mudville this day. And if I come next year and talk about Giotto, then we get into the Alfred Hitchcock of Giotto. Because the next thing you do is you zoom in on that figure in the background and the music suddenly changes to dun, dun, dun. Right? But we'll leave that for another day. Or this scene, the birth of the Virgin Mary. And that larvae-like looking object that you see is it's actually the newborn Virgin Mary. It gives you a kick every time. Postpartum Anne. Right? Now, one of the comments I make over and over again is that the older I get, the more I appreciate Giotto. And after having fathered two children myself, this is such a realistic representation of what happens. After having watched your wife go through hours of excruciating labor, thinking that she may die, may not make it through it because it looks like such a painful thing that no man, I think, can ever endure, the fatigue, the exhaustion, as soon as that child appears, all of it just magically disappears. Look at Anne, who's now up, and all she wants to do is get her hands on her child. And it's just such a realistic representation. By the way, Vasari said that Giotto, in addition to being such an extraordinary painter, was also a very virile man. The father, we're told, there was many, I think it was 11 or 13 children or so. Presumably he'd seen some of these kids born, which is why it's such an accurate representation. So this joyous moment that you see. While we're at it, if that's the Virgin Mary, then who's that? No, it's the Virgin Mary as well. This is very typical for Gothic painting, to essentially repeat the same figure more than once in the same scene, because they simply did not know how else to sort of tell the story. And this is essentially clearing out the gunk, to use a technical term, from the nose of the Virgin Mary. One of the first things you do, of course, is to suction out. Well, they didn't have those rubber syringes back then, so they did it manually. Now, this is pretty extraordinary, because we're talking about the birth of the Virgin Mary, which most of us imagine is happening that either the Virgin Mary flew out of the womb or walked out with an evening gown and, stiletto heels or something like that. Instead, this is a very human birth. And my favorite part of all this is the exchange that you're seeing here. So here's one of the midwives who's collected all the towels or what have you that they've used, wrapped them up, and she encounters this figure to the outside. And you can clearly see that there's an exchange going on between them. And what question would this woman be asking that woman who's inside the room? Question we don't ask anymore because we usually know in advance: boy or girl? And that's an emotion, this notion of curiosity, of anticipation almost, for what's actually happening inside of the room. And anticipation in anticipation of what comes next. Okay, and so this emotion and how it is expressed in the history of art. And this leads up to my absolute favorite sequence of paintings ever. We're back in the Scrivani Chapel. The story goes that the Virgin Mary grew up to be so beautiful and virtuous that every young man in Nazareth desired her in marriage. The question was, which one of these young men deserved her? Legend maintains that the priests at the temple got involved. Here they are again. And they simply invited all the young men interested in the Virgin Mary to present themselves at temple with a rod, with a stick. These rods and or sticks would be collected, they would be blessed, and one of these rods presumably would distinguish itself from the others, and the bearer would be the man designated to win the hand of the Virgin Mary, that God would intervene and cause this to happen. So here's Giotto, now painted. Remember, when you're looking at this art, the analogy that I use over and over is to look at it the same way you'd look at a movie today. So it is a movie director reading a screenplay. Giotto is reading the life of the Virgin Mary from the Golden Legend. And this is how he visualizes the scene. Right? So here are these young men with brown hair presenting their rods. You see, that's the name of the scene. And the story goes that there was one man in Nazareth who was particularly fond of the Virgin Mary, but was significantly older than she was, as well as all the other suitors. And his name was Joseph. And we see that there is an older man here in line. And he's not old, he's older, because he has the George Clooney salt and pepper thing going. You see that? Different from the Joachim, just full head of white hair that we saw before. And he was a bit insecure. He was uncertain. Do I do it? Do I not do it, technically speaking? Right? Because essentially he felt foolish in participating. So we go to the next scene. And here's where the anticipation actually takes place. The watching of the rods. Now, how many of you have actually been inside of the Scrivani Chapel in Padua? It's not that big. Some of you more recently than that. It's not that big. And for Giotto to waste an entire section of wall for a scene that we call the watching of the rod. What is happening in the scene? Nothing is happening in this scene. He dedicates an entire scene to nothing, for the simple purpose of building up the anticipation. It's suspense. It's this literary sort of text. You could go from A to B, but if you go from lowercase a to capital B to capital C, it obviously makes the story more dramatic. It's this notion of imbuing these religious stories with a human element, and that human element is emotion. So here they are. Can't you hear the Jeopardy music playing in the background here? Da, na, 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 da. We're all waiting to see one of these sticks do something magical. Well, the story goes that in the end, Joseph did not participate in the competition. He simply felt too foolish. He remained, and I'm quoting here, at the back of the temple with his rod in hand. Right? And here he is. I don't know if you can make him out. You can identify him, the salt and pepper thing, and that little piece of halo that pops out as well. And while everyone's looking at this pile of rods up on the altar, Joseph's rod miraculously burst forth into bloom. I'm not kidding. A lily popped out of the top of Joseph's rod, a dove descended from the sky, and everyone realized, of course, that he was the man designated to marry the Virgin Mary. And so here we have the betrothal of the two of them. I mean, this emotion that's not just a simple portrayal, but now that Giotto was able to represent over 3 scenes, over time moving. And of course, it is that Hollywood happy ending that we get. And look at the reaction of all the other suitors here. This guy, he wants to take a look at that rod. I say, okay, closer look there, something a little funny. This guy is breaking his rod, and you can interpret that however you like, technically. And the laughter. It's early 14th century art. Believe me, there's usually not enough room for artists to include comedy or comic elements. And Giotto set off a kind of landslide of this, because it was Giotto's student, Taddeo Gaddi, who was also Giotto's godson, who painted what I think is the funniest figure in the entire history of art. Taddeo Gaddi, in the Florentine church of Santa Croce, painted exactly the same scene. The marriage of the Virgin. There's Joseph, there's the magic rod, here is the wedding ring being put onto the hand of the Virgin Mary. And if you look over here, you see the group of suitors, the defeated suitors, breaking the rod, crying fall. And right here is that most funny figure of all time, who is leaving, dejected and demoralized, with nothing less than a sapling on his shoulder. So clearly the moral of the story is it's not the size of the rod that matters. It's the magical qualities. That comic aspect was not lost. I mean, that's the common denominator in all of this, whether it's the banana or whether it's the Mona Lisa or whatever it might be, the common denominator is humanity and that human condition that we have, the highs and the lows, and represented in so many different ways. Perhaps the most dramatic dramatic representation of anticipation for me is with this guy, right? Michelangelo's David. And every time you see this in person, it really is a kind of breathtaking experience. David, as in David versus Goliath. Now, you'd be amazed at how many people don't realize that this is a representation of the biblical figure from the book of Samuel and his encounter with the giant, the Philistine, Goliath. Now, my question to all of you, and we'll save our discussion of the statue for another time, or perhaps standing underneath the statue itself. How do we know that this is a representation of the biblical figure David from the first book of Samuel? Anyone? 2 things. The sling, not slingshot, but sling. It's a long strap, technically. So I used to refer to it as not being the Huckleberry Finn slingshot with the elastic. With my younger audience, I say the Bart Simpson slingshot. That's not what David used, right? This is that long strap version. It starts here in his left hand, which is where the pouch is. You see it here? There's David's thumb. Okay? So this is where the stone actually would be inserted. That sling then extends all the way down his back. That band that you see is the sling, extends all the way into his right hand where he's holding the stone. So we have 2 things to go on, the sling and the stone. Michelangelo breaking with traditional David iconography, where most of the time we know it's a representation of David because of the disembodied head of Goliath. That's how we do David's in Florence. You see a young man standing over a disembodied head with a rock buried between its eyes. There's about a 9.5 chance in 10 that you're looking at David. Right? Well, Michelangelo does away with the head, probably because his interpretation of the subject is a different one. If the head's not there, it probably means that David has not slain Goliath yet. Right? Now, this is still an object for debate, but I'm 100% convinced that this is actually a representation of the before moment. And imagine Michelangelo getting ready to carve the David and rereading the story of David in the book of Samuel. And the first thing we find out about David is that he was very young. And when you're young, you think you're immortal. Probably gave him this sort of false sense of confidence. Then we hear that David was very confident that he could fight Goliath, because when he argued with King Saul, his argument was that when he was protecting his father's sheep, because he was a shepherd by profession, he was protecting those sheep from wolves and lions. You remember that little episode, right? So the implication is, how much more difficult can it be to kill a man than it is to kill a wolf or a lion? And the third thing is that David is faithful. He's convinced that because he's defending Israel, that Yahweh is going to defend him. So this is that kid who's got it all under control. This is way too confident a stance for what is about to happen. The sling thrown casually over his shoulder. Remember, when he's killing those wolves and lions, he's presumably killing them with the sling. So the sling thrown over, the rock, you can almost imagine it going up and down. But then, when we look at the physiological details, look at those Clint Eastwood in his prime eyes of David. He's staring really hard at something. The furrowed brow, the flared nostrils, the tense mouth, the squared jaw that you see there. Right? You tie that into the six-pack that he has in this. This is not just the result of his perfect body. It's an extended diaphragm. And Michelangelo has depicted that very moment of the story where it sinks into David's mind just how big Goliath actually is. And so, in fact, if I could turn the volume up, the two words coming out of his mouth are, because that is the moment that Michelangelo has captured with the David. That very moment, technically, when he realizes, no pun intended, the enormity of the task at hand. And he's got to make that choice. And that choice is either to turn around, run away, and watch sheep for the rest of his natural life, or to step up, fight the giant, and to step into the history books. Anticipation. And the amazing thing about the David is you're standing there looking at it, and it's this nude man with a slingshot most people don't recognize, a rock you can't see, and a tree trunk thrown behind his leg, and all of that emotion comes out. And that's part of the reason why the sculpture is as extraordinary as it is. And now another bit more sensual representation of anticipation, and that is Titian's great Assumption of the Virgin Mary in the Church of the Frari in Venice. When you normally see Assumptions, Mary just sort of passively stands there and is either carried up by angels or pulled up by God or what have you. Here instead, she's just a little too eager. And as she looks up, and she looks like she's doing the sort of, what's that dance? Not the jitterbug, the other one there, where she's sort of pushing her feet one in front of the other, twisting, looking up at God. In fact, the Franciscan friars who had commissioned the painting were a little put off by this and were unsure whether or not to actually insert it as the high altarpiece of their church, because they'd never seen the Virgin Mary look so desirous before in an almost physical way. And so this notion, again, of anticipation, of showing emotion, in this case through bodily gesture and bodily expression. All right? Okay, we move on. Fear. Right, now, many different instances. I've chosen one of the more iconic subjects through which to express this emotion of fear. And we begin with the great Annunciation by Simone Martini in the Uffizi Gallery. The angel Gabriel. Right? Again, this is the story recounted in the Gospel of Luke of when the angel came to announce to Mary that she is to be the mother of God. And the raised wings are a standard aspect of Annunciations, because the idea is that the angel has just landed, holding its olive branch with its olive branch crown, meaning that the angel has come in peace. The white lilies that are omnipresent in Annunciations and symbolizing Mary's physical purity, her virginity. And the words of the angel, in relief, coming out of the angel's mouth. There are letters here on the surface of the painting, which are legible. I know you can't see them that well, but they read, Ave, gratia plena Dominus tecum. Ave, hail, the word that's missing but implied. Mary, gratia plena, full of grace. Dominus tecum, the Lord is with you. So the first words of the prayer we call the Hail Mary are the words allegedly spoken by the angel to Mary. How is the Virgin Mary taking that message? Fear. Right? My students always say she looks PO'd, right? By which I mean put off by the whole thing. And again, put it in perspective. She's a 10 to 13-year-old girl. She has not had a boyfriend yet at this point in her life. She just found out she's pregnant, and now she has to explain all of this to her Jewish parents, right? So I think she's taken it pretty well, all things considered. Fear, the fear of this divine encounter. Consider that Leonardo da Vinci said that the Virgin Mary in Botticelli's famous Annunciation looks so frightened that it appears that she would rather jump out the window than to be the mother of Jesus Christ. And so here, this sort of exaggerated reaction to the angel's message. Well, how did Leonardo treat his then Virgin Mary? Well, she's much more calm and composed. You see her? This is his famous Annunciation in the Uffizi Gallery. I see a kind of Southern belle composure in her. She does that kind of dainty thing with the left hand. You can almost hear the polite ooh, coming out of her mouth as she looks up and sees the angel. And I'm not going to feign the Southern accent here, but calm and composed. Look at the right hand, though, and the way it kind of darts out, and she grabs a pretty tall stack of Scripture here, and she's bending the Scripture with force. She is nervous. She is scared. She's just expressing that fear in a much more subtle way than the contrived gestures that we saw before. So the more obvious and the more subtle representations. Or how about the fear expressed by this female figure? One of the most sublime works of art that you will ever encounter, and that is Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Apollo and Daphne statue in the Borghese Gallery in Rome, where the god Apollo, desirous of the nymph Daphne, and when he thinks he finally has her, she is saved by her father by being transformed into a laurel tree. Now, the magic of this statue is the fact that in marble, in a material which, if you were to punch, you would hurt yourself quite badly, Bernini has brought the sculpture to life. We actually see the transformation. The next detail is right here. Look at her toes turning into roots growing down. The bark beginning to extend over her body, the fingers transforming into twigs, and the complete indifference. We're going back to the classical sculpture I began with. He's a god. There's no effort, there's no strain, there's no anything in Apollo, except for the fact that Cupid had played this trick and shot him with a dart that made him desirous of this figure. She instead, with this expression of just sheer desperation, as she realizes that she cannot outrun the god, fear. And done in an almost balletic way. I mean, there's a divine aspect to this fear that only Bernini could capture. And he does it just as well in his other sculpture in the Borghese collection, which is the Pluto and Persephone, the god of the underworld, kidnapping essentially Persephone, taking her down into the underworld with him, which is where she would remain for 2/3 of the year, and then would come up for a third. This is how the Greeks actually explained the cyclical seasons that went on, and the magic of Bernini in showing the god just overpowering the nymph. And look at that expression here of just fear and dread and almost submission at the same time. The special effects in these statues are just mind-boggling, particularly the distortion of his left eye. Can you see that? One of the things I continue to repeat when I'm standing in front of these statues is the three words, "It is rock." I'll just stop here and it is rock, because it doesn't look like rock. It looks like flesh and blood and skin and bones and what have you as well. And when you see the detailing up close, I mean, it looks like a black and white photograph of male hands buried into soft, pliable flesh. It is rock. You're looking at marble that has been turned into pulsating flesh. Here's the black and white. Here's the color. It really is just mind-boggling when you see. And so that emotion that's then captured inside, obviously, of just this extraordinarily beautiful and delicate rendering. Okay? To horror. And not surprisingly, the artist who I showcase in my representation of horror is Caravaggio, right? The master. And so this is his martyrdom of St. Matthew from the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome. Here is Matthew the evangelist being assassinated, technically. And this figure, right, who he actually borrowed from a Donatello sculpture. I don't have the image because I just couldn't find a good enough reproduction of it. But this is such a typical, this is us driving down the highway when there's an accident. And we're causing more accidents because, oh my God, that's horrible. Right? And you just kind of, Because it is horrible. And there's a man being killed, but at the same time, we're fascinated by that. You see that? So it's that horror that we don't want, but we do want at the same time. It's an extraordinary, again, representation of the human condition. Or how about that horror? His decapitation. This is Judith, the Hebrew widow from Bethulia, seducing, inebriating, and then finally decapitating the Assyrian general, Holofernes. Now, she has to do this. And there is a certain look of horror on her face at the fact that she's cutting off a man's head. But at the same time, it's not total repulsion, is it? Almost like, well, let's see if I go a little bit further what's actually going to happen. It's amazing how Caravaggio is able to capture this. And again, I don't want to get biographical here, but some would say that it took someone who was so familiar with violence, mortal violence. In fact, he stabbed and killed a man in 1606 to then represent it as accurately as Caravaggio did. Look at the indifference of the maidservant here, looking on eagerly, waiting to collect the head. And speaking of severed heads, Caravaggio again, right, in a double self-portrait of David with the head of Goliath. A double self-portrait, there's a long story behind this, but this is an idealized representation of himself in an act of contrition to the then Pope, whose name was Paul VI, the Borghese Pope, who had pardoned him of his capital crime of murder in exchange for a couple of paintings. And so the message that Caravaggio was saying is that, look, I've cut off my own head, because that is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. I've cut off this craziness. I've cut off this head of pride and rebellion and what have you, and I offer it up to you. And so that look of horror, I mean, it's almost as if it's frozen on the face of Goliath, that look of disbelief that, I can't be dying, technically speaking, and that wound that you see on his head. No one better than Caravaggio, and perhaps the most famous, I think, and successful rendering of that look of horror is, of course, the Medusa shield in the Uffizi. Okay, where it's that same, it's not just this rendering of the head, it is the rendering of the head at the very moment where it was severed from the body, and Caravaggio freezes it there. And in fact, this is a self-portrait. This is Caravaggio. He was still young at the time. This is 1597, so he's 26 years old, with this snake headdress that he's put around him as well. All the art that I've showed you thus far, the Giotto stuff and the Michelangelo stuff, imagine the impact that this had. I always refer to Caravaggio as a visual sledgehammer in the history of art. Right? Okay, surprise, right? And this notion of being surprised, technically speaking. And the work of art that I use is one of my favorites, and that is the bronze relief sculpture by, by Filippo Brunelleschi, who of course we all imagine as an architect, but he started off as a goldsmith. This is his losing competition panel, as it's called, depicting the sacrifice of Isaac. And if you're not familiar with the story, God playing this sort of nasty trick on Abraham by asking him to demonstrate his faith by killing his only son, whose name was Isaac. And so Abraham takes his son, binds him, brings him up to the mountaintop, is about to kill his son when an angel shows up just in the nick of time and says, "We were just kidding, just a bad joke, right? You don't have to go through with it, technically speaking." But naturalism, trying to show things in a realistic way, trying to show emotion in a realistic way. And imagine, kind of like Judith back there cutting off the head of Holofernes, imagine having to go through with this. So what do? You work yourself up into a semi-catatonic trance. Must kill Isaac. You got to do it, right? And so there he is, and look at Isaac just writhing, struggling to break free. Abraham aggressively leaning in. The knife. If this were the movie, there'd be blood trickling. There's contact that's being made, and then the angel appearing just in the nick of time, performing this jujitsu maneuver, right? Because he pulls that wrist up, and look at that expression. You know that feeling where it's like the last thing you would have imagined, the very last thing you would have imagined is not having to go through. I mean, this is cruel almost to this point. And that look on Abraham's face like a bucket of ice water. It's extraordinary. Brunelleschi, the guy who built the dome, did that. And it shows you, of course, this notion now of naturalism trying to include this notion of emotion as well. Perhaps the most famous and successful rendering This whole lecture, it could have been simply the Scrovegni Chapel or Leonardo's Last Supper. All right? If any of you are familiar with the Italian Nobel Prize winner, Dario Fo, he's a great playwright and actor. He would take his students to see Leonardo's Last Supper, and they would learn gesticulation from this painting. I mean, Leonardo taking art at this point into what we call the High Renaissance. This is this moment where form and content are on an equal playing field. Right? Essentially, most of the 15th century was just about form, trying to figure it out, trying to make it look real. Now, all of a sudden, instead of making it look like Leonardo has created an event, it looks like Leonardo has captured an event. He's one of these great photographers who just have a knack for being in the right place at the right time with the camera at the ready. And so he was lying on the floor smoking a cigarette in the upper room of the inn when Jesus and 12, soon to be 11 of his best buddies are sharing the last meal, and his spider sense goes off. And so he gets the camera ready, and boom, he takes the snapshot of the split second where Jesus Christ drops the bomb on all of the apostles. And that bomb is that this night, one of you will betray me. And the shockwaves, the ripples that go off in all directions here. It's extraordinary. To make it work, the gesture, the action, the reaction, the emotion, and to make it convincingly spontaneous is just an extraordinary thing. And so, and the organization, I mean, it's the same sort of thing that we get into when we study film and the history of cinematography, but how he's grouped them up into three groups of three. So let's start on the left-hand side, right, with the group of Bartholomew. Now, we all know this. You see this over and over again in film where he jumps up and in his thrust upward, the chair probably just pushed back behind him. You know, that kind of cliche scene that you see all the time. Here is St. James the Minor, kind of leaning over. You see his left hand right there saying, what's going on? Here's St. Andrew with his hand sort of up, oh God. Right, you can almost hear the sounds and the comments that they make at the same time. To the right of them, we have the main group. Here's Peter. Peter, the burly fisherman, saying, I'll kill him. Where is he? I'll kill him. Look at the knife there. Right, aggressively leaning towards Jesus. Here is John, the beloved apostle, who I call John the lush apostle, because he drank too much at the Last Supper, and he's thinking, God, I should not have had that last margarita. I don't know what's going on, as he sort of leans away. And here is Judas. All right, now, Judas, darker, lower than everyone else. We know he's the bad guy, taking advantage of all the confusion. Saying, I wonder if everyone's going to eat that piece of bread. That left hand extending out, which, of course, is how three of the gospel writers claim that he identified himself as the traitor. The bag of silver in his right hand. And I still remember as a child hearing all the time that Judas also knocks over the salt cellar in the painting. And I could never see it. I don't see Judas knocking over the salt cellar. And only recently, and by recently I mean within the last decade or so, did I realize that much of what we discuss when talking about Leonardo's Last Supper, we discuss by actually looking at a copy of Leonardo's Last Supper. The most famous of which is the one here in Oxford. In other words, his painting is so worn that you can't see much of the detail, but fortunately there were so many copies made. Can you see the salt cellar right there? That's being knocked over. And so curiously, we presume, of course, that these artists were faithful in their reproduction, and so that's actually what we're using instead. Okay, back here to Jesus, isolated in the center. Look at James the Great, and this is such a typical, the woe. I mean, the emotional impact of what Jesus has just said physically pushes him backwards in the scene. Here is Thomas with that probing finger. Now you hold on 1 second. That same finger that will probe Jesus' wound now instead, causing essentially this moment of hesitation. Here is St. Philip bringing his hands to his chest. And again, all you have to do is to walk into an Italian bar or cafe on a Monday morning after the soccer games or the day after an election or the day. And these gestures are still so much alive in Italian culture. It's mind-boggling to see them represented here 6 centuries ago. Here is St. Matthew. Hey, did you hear what that guy said? And this guy saying, this is Thaddeus saying, hey, did you hear what that guy said? And then finally here we have Simon to say, yeah, I did hear what that guy said. Right? And these gestures, each one of these could be its own little vignette, but every one of these 4 groups of 3 make up this larger vignette, which is the Last Supper. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Because again, when you think of Leonardo, I mean, we're not really thinking of a thespian. We're not thinking about, a playwright. We're thinking about a scientist. But obviously, a scientist who could delve in and almost dissect the human soul and how to represent these vignettes of emotion. And lastly, what I think, this was originally scheduled for Valentine's Day. No, what I think is not only the most impressive painting in the Scrivania Chapel, but what I think, and this is personal, subjective of course, is the most powerful painting in the entire history of art. And that is the Betrayal. The Kiss of Judas, painted by Giotto in the Scrivania Chapel. And this is the one that I always try to encourage people to see almost as a movie scene. They're up on Gethsemane, the Garden of Olives. After the Last Supper, it's deep into the night. It would have been just dead silent. And the effect, when you're in a movie theater, and now they have these speakers up and down, and they get that volume so high that you're kind of looking around saying, do they mean to make it this uncomfortable? And they do mean to make it that uncomfortable because they want to make it a full kind of sensory experience. And that's what I hear when I look at this painting. I hear this painting because that silence at Gethsemane was just violated by this throng of people who've just come into the scene, and the rattling and the trumpet sounding and the talking and the jostling and what have you. There's Peter leaning in with that knife cutting off the ear of the servant of the Sanhedrin. And if I'm the movie director, what I do is I just drop the sound completely, pull it out, and then you do the close-up. And you think about the emotional impact. Now, it's Jesus, and so there's this divine aspect, and there's an indifference in his expression, right? He probably knew that this was going to happen. Did Jesus feel disappointment? Did Jesus feel betrayed like we all do? Did Judas break Jesus' heart when he did this? And obviously there are different interpretations. But how about poor Judas? Looking into the eyes of Jesus Christ, of God, of all things that's good, and betraying him, essentially proving why human beings were kicked out of Eden in the first place, why we deserve that mea culpa sort of notion. I mean, it's incredibly profound what Giotto is trying to do. And I still remember when I saw this painting for the first time back in 1993 as an undergraduate student, before the restoration of the Scrivania Chapel, and immediately this painting evoked another visual image in my mind, one of the most iconic in the history of visual arts. It's absurd for me to compare an early 14th century painting to a 20th century cinematic masterpiece, but I just did, and it worked. And it's absurd for me to tell you that Francis Ford Coppola went to see the Scrivania Chapel before he began the filming of The Godfather. I don't know if he did or he didn't. But the fact that I can successfully connect the two of them is a pretty extraordinary thing. And again, there's that common denominator in the history of all arts. And that common denominator is the human condition and this notion of emotion and this breaking your heart. A brother who was discovered that his brother just tried to have him killed. Did Fredo break Michael's heart? Yeah, he did break his heart. And so this notion, again, of emotion being communicated visually. And with that, I'll finish up. Thank you very much.